Right, RPM. This is going to be very mathy, so I do apologise. Right, by RPM, I do mean rounds per minute, the rate of fire buff, as well as rounds per second. We're going to be going over all of it, and this video is very, very heavily influenced by a lot of IKEA's work. So if you don't know who IKEA is, there's a link in the description. Go check him out. He is a sexy, sexy man, and I keep telling him on repeat, and he still won't sleep with me. I'm upset. Now, to fully understand the basics of this, we kind of have to go over the real basics, which is what burst DPS is and how to calculate it, and then the same again with sustained DPS. Mostly the thing to take note of here is how we calculate it, because we're going to be converting the weapon's RPM into RPS, and then utilizing that RPS into a stable equation to show how much damage we will be doing at a specific intersection. This is the thing that a lot of people don't get. It's the specific intersection. So this is the DPS equation. It's very simple. It's just your damage times your rounds per second. To get your rounds per second, just take your rounds per minute, which is how the game shows our overall rate of fire, rounds per minute, and divide it by 60. This converts your rounds per minute into rounds per second, and then you'll times this by your damage. An easy weapon to do this on is going to be the AKM, which is what we're going to be using for a lot of the examples. The reason for this is 600 RPM. 600 RPM divided by 60 is 10 rounds per second. Really bloody simple. Then with sustained DPS, we have magazine times damage, which is then divided by your reload plus magazine divided by rounds per second. Now, the reason we have to go over these is because what you need to understand, and despite other people saying weird things about this, the biggest multiplier to your DPS is your rounds per second, because without rounds per second, you just don't have DPS at all. And you are actually fully capable of compensating for accuracy with the sheer volume of firepower. Now, if you would like to dispute this, then I'd like to introduce you to the American Army. This is basically their entire principle. Peace through superior firepower. The A10 Warthog is another very good one. These things fire like 6,000 rounds per second, and they have like an accuracy rating of like 4%. They will still destroy you and your entire family tree. Now, if you'd like an actual in-game example, then I'd like to present this clip. I am aiming at the Wally, as you can see, and a red just runs across, and I still put 3 bullets into him. Wasn't aiming at him, he ran across my field of view into the path of fire. Accuracy, I'm not saying it doesn't count for anything. Obviously, if you're off pissing into the wind, you can have all the DPS in the world, but if you're not hitting anything, it's still 0. However, like I said, this can be compensated for by just putting as many rounds downrange as humanly possible. So what exactly is it that burst DPS is doing? Well, again, AKM has a base damage of 60,645, and all DPS is calculating is how many times do we hit within that second. At 600 RPM, we will hit 10 times in a second. So here you have the calculations, up to 6 seconds, and then here is up to 10. So if you hit all 10 shots within 1 second, you will do 606,450 damage. It's pretty simple, realistically. Now we can of course do this for sustained DPS. You can see the full track here. How sustained DPS is calculated in this way, I have absolutely no bloody idea. I would assume it's doing 1 shot, reload, 1 shot, and it's calculating the average DPS throughout that entire interaction. But to be perfectly honest, even if you did do it that way, it wouldn't come out as low as this, which is, it's bizarre. I don't understand it. So we're not going to actually look at how individual shots are counted within the DPS on sustained. Now, the next thing we need to look at is what exactly is DPS, because some people have some weird and wacky ideas about this, which is beyond bizarre, and I believe it's led to a lot of confusions, and it's kind of mind-numbing for me because it's in the bloody name, DPS, damage per second. So if we just give a nondescript graph that is absolutely not to scale or representing anything other than an example of how this works, as the line goes up, that's us shooting. As the line flattens out, that's us reloading. Up, shooting, flattens out, reloading. Now, from 0 to the first peak of where it first flattens out, that entire line is our total magazine damage, not DPS. Then, if we then break down this graph a little bit further and add in 2 extra lines, we will get something that looks like this. Now, this still isn't looking at DPS. What both of these actually show is your total ammo pool output. Between the reload points, that's your total magazine. The full lines is your total ammo output. The red line is taking into consideration just firing. It removes the reload. So essentially Bullet King. So unless you're using Bullet King, this red line is impossible to even happen. The zigzag line is obviously, again, total magazine, reload, total magazine, reload, until we're out of ammo. And where they both end, the red line and the yellow line will end at the same point, just X amount of seconds apart, depending on how much time you spent reloading. This green line is essentially going to do the exact same thing, but the main takeaway here is just the magazine point, which is where that black line is. And what this is doing is, rather than the zigzag line saying you firing time is 4 seconds, reload for 2, what that green line is saying is your total magazine uptime is 6 seconds, 4 plus 2. So what does any of this actually have to do with RPM? And I'm glad you asked. What DPS actually is and where your RPM or RPS at this point actually matters is nothing to do with the entirety of those lines. Nothing at all. Which is what so many people seem to think when we talk about DPS. When we talk about DPS, they're imagining that entire line. They're imagining all of this and that we are giving all of this an individual number. No, that is not what is happening. What we are in fact looking at is this. DPS, damage per second. We are literally looking at 1 second intervals. So you can put an arrow anywhere along this red line, that's your burst DPS, 1 second interval. Same with sustain, anywhere along the green line, an arrow, that is your sustained DPS. It's an average for a 1 second point across the entire line. It won't change no matter where you put that arrow, but we are literally looking at 1 damn second. Now, hopefully that explains the whole DPS side of things. What we now need to look into is why some weapons just outright perform better than others. And we're going to stick with our tried and tested AKM, and we're going to compare it against the FAMAS. This is pretty damn simple. So an AKM has 600 RPM and a FAMAS has 900 RPM. 600 divided by 60 equals 10, and 900 divided by 60 equals 15. Now the base damage values of these weapons is AKM 60, 645 and 44191. So if we multiply these by our rounds per second, we get this, which is our DPS. Some of you might be able to tell if we just subtract one from the other, there's a difference of 56,415, which is just over 1 bullet's worth of the FAMAS. Now this is something I've done for all of the ARs. I'm aware it's small, but if you need to pause it, please do go ahead. But hopefully we can see here that there is a bit of a disparity between RPM and RPS, as well as what RPS actually is being equated to. You will notice that the lower the RPS, the higher the base damage. However, there is one large thing we need to take into account here, and that is quite simply that there are a lot of mechanics in the game that require stacking. Yeah, so those extra 5 bullets per second are also an extra 5 stacks per second. Now, although it is very rare, especially in the case of like, if we were just looking at striker stacks without anything else, gaining them at base with vanilla weapons, at no point really does the FAMAS actually catch up to the actual damage, the individual shot for shot bullet damage that the AKM is able to produce. I think it gets to like 7% difference. They start out at like 27%, but due to the extra 5 stacks per second, FAMAS can make up essentially 20% of that. This then leads into an entirely separate problem, being strikers. It has a 15% rate of fire increase. So if we add strikers into this, hopefully we can see that the difference in gains on that 15%, I'm aware the gains per second, some of them are like 2.25. Obviously we can't get 25% of the bullet. That's just the disparaging nature of calculating bullets per second. It's annoying. However, hopefully we should be able to see that Bighorn at 800 RPM gives us exactly 2 extra bullets per second with a 15% increase. So if you're below 800 RPM, you get 1 bullet per second essentially, 1.x. If you're above 800 RPM, you're going to get 2 plus. This essentially means that on something like Strikers, you don't want to go below 800 RPM. This is also the reason that Strikers Ouroboros is so damn powerful within this situation. Simply just because even at 800 RPM, we gain an extra 2 bullets per second. So what happens if we hit 1688? Which also, quick segue, Oreo has 1350 RPM with a 10% ROF mod, giving us 1485. Obviously, if we take 1485 and times it by the 15% from Strikers, we would actually get 1708. So what's actually going on here? Well, it's quite simply the mod adds to Strikers. So what we have to do is, to put it simply, 10 plus 15 is 25, so 1350 times 1.25 gives us the 1688. So just to show the gap, at 1485 RPM, we're going to gain 25 stacks per second, but at 1688, we're going to be gaining 28. So this is essentially 3 more stacks per second with a 15% increase, as opposed to 800 RPM with 2 and 600 RPM with 1. So yeah, this is kind of essentially how Strikers favors rate of fire. And also how RPM is essentially a direct amplifier to your DPS. Not your damage. Increasing your rate of fire isn't going to increase your bullet damage. You're not going to go from 10 to 20 to 30. But you are going to do, over the duration of the fight, as well as your DPS, more. 15% more typically. And I say duration as though you are able to continuously and constantly fire, which isn't always going to be the case, but it does also mean that when you are up and firing, you are going to be doing 15% more. Now, this has been a pretty lengthy video with a lot of talking and rambling, and I'm not sure if I've made this clear at all. Takeaway point is RPM is kind of silly. It's probably one of the biggest multipliers we actually have in the game. It's also what makes Strikers so strong, and it's also what makes weapons like Ouroboros that have insane fire rates, but not just Ouroboros as well. Anything above 800 RPM is going to do exceptionally well on something like Strikers. 1, stack gains, which is going to allow you to close the gap between something like FAMAS and our AKM. Although AKM has a lower fire rate, it does do a lot more damage per shot. On something like Strikers, FAMAS is going to essentially overall outperform it quite easily. However, me saying this does also mean that if they're both at maximum stacks, the gap goes back to being the same. What I mean by this is during the stacking process. So depending on how long each or both of them would take to stack, or at least get Strikers to maximum stacks, during that stacking process, whatever one has the faster RPM is going to be the better option. This is also the same with Obliterate, Heartbreaker. Essentially anything that stacks per hit, faster RPM is always the better option. The only caveat to this could potentially be something along the lines of shotguns, where they have somewhat slower RPM, but also hit multiple times per shot. Except in this case, Obliterate doesn't actually work this way. Anyway, that is going to do it for this video. Hopefully I've not made a complete mess of this. Have fun, good luck, don't die. It's bad for the health.